The blood on Viola Jensen's hands came from the rancher's wife, who lay gasping on the kitchen table. And Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood in the doorway declaring that any treatment besides his own would be nothing short of murder. It was 1874 in Old Tucson, Arizona Territory, where the summer heat could kill a man as quickly as a bullet, and where Viola had been gathering herbs in the desert since she was old enough to walk beside her grandmother's skirt. The rancher's wife, Sarah, had been bleeding for 2 days after a difficult birth, and the doctor's leeches and laudanum had only made her weaker. "You will remove yourself from this house immediately, Miss Jensen, or I will have the sheriff drag you out in irons," Dr. Whitfield said, his face red beneath his carefully trimmed beard. He wore a fine wool suit despite the oppressive heat, and carried his black medical bag like a badge of authority. "Your quackery has no place in civilized medicine." Viola did not move from Sarah's side. She pressed a clean cloth against the woman's abdomen, her other hand checking the pulse at her throat. Too fast, too weak. Sarah's husband, Tom, stood in the corner with his newborn son wrapped in a blanket, his face torn between the doctor's credentials and the fact that his wife was dying despite 3 days of professional care. "Tom," Viola said quietly, not taking her eyes from Sarah's pale face, "your wife is bleeding inside. The doctor's methods are not stopping it. I have seen this before. I can help her, but you must decide now." "She is a fraud," Dr. Whitfield spat. "She has no medical training, no education, nothing but old wives' tales and dangerous superstition. If this woman dies under her care, you will be responsible." Tom looked at his wife, at the woman he had loved since they were both 15 years old, at the mother of his newborn son, who had not yet opened her eyes to see him. He looked at the doctor, who had arrived 3 days ago with his impressive credentials from a medical college back east. Then he looked at Viola, who had delivered half the babies in Old Tucson without losing a single mother, who had cured his brother of a fever that had nearly killed him, who asked for payment in eggs or vegetables because she knew most families had little else to give. "Get out," Tom said to the doctor. Dr. Whitfield's face went from red to purple. "You are condemning your wife to death. I will make sure everyone in this territory knows that this charlatan killed Sarah Porter. Mark my words, this fraud will be run out of town before the month is through." He stormed from the house, and Viola heard his horse galloping away moments later. She did not have time to worry about his threats. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, and her skin felt cold despite the heat. "I need you to boil water," Viola told Tom, "and bring me my saddlebags from my horse." Tom moved quickly, grateful to have something to do. Viola worked with steady hands, crushing dried yarrow and shepherd's purse, mixing them with golden seal root. She had learned these remedies from her grandmother, who had learned them from her grandmother, a line of healing women stretching back further than anyone could remember. The herbs grew in the desert and mountains around Old Tucson, and Viola knew every plant, every root, every flower that could heal or harm. She prepared a tea from the herbs and managed to get Sarah to swallow small sips. Then she made a poultice and pressed it against the woman's abdomen, her hands moving with practiced confidence. She had seen internal bleeding before, had treated it successfully when doctors had given up. The herbs would help the blood to clot, would strengthen Sarah's body, would give her a fighting chance. For 3 hours, Viola worked without rest. Tom hovered nearby with his son, watching as color slowly began to return to his wife's face. Sarah's breathing deepened, became more regular. Her pulse grew stronger under Viola's fingers. As the sun began to set, painting the desert outside in shades of orange and gold, Sarah's eyes finally opened. "Tom," she whispered, and her husband rushed to her side with tears streaming down his weathered face. "You are going to be well," Viola said gently, checking the poultice. "The bleeding has stopped. You will need rest, plenty of water, and I will leave more herbs for tea. Drink it 3 times a day for the next week." "Thank you," Tom said, his voice breaking. "Thank you, Miss Jensen. How can we ever repay you?" "Take care of your wife and your son," Viola replied. "That is payment enough." She gathered her things as the moon rose over the desert, climbing onto her sturdy mare. The ride back to her small cabin on the edge of town would take half an hour, and she was bone tired. But Sarah would live. The baby would have his mother. That was what mattered. What Viola did not know was that a man had been watching from the ridge above the Porter Ranch. A man who had seen the doctor storm away in fury, who had waited and watched to see if the woman would emerge alive, or if there would be a funeral to prepare. His name was Henry Booker, though most people just called him the Mountain Man, and he had been living in the Catalina Mountains north of Old Tucson for the past 5 years. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer, arms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood and hunting and surviving in the wilderness. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his beard was trimmed just enough to keep it from being wild. He wore buckskin clothing he had made himself, and carried a rifle that had saved his life more times than he could count. Henry had come down from the mountains to trade furs and to buy supplies, but he had heard talk in town about the doctor and the herbalist, about the battle between modern medicine and old wisdom. He had no love for doctors. A doctor back in Missouri had killed his mother with his treatments, had bled her until she was too weak to fight the fever. A doctor had told his father that nothing could be done for his injured leg, and his father had lost the limb. Henry had learned to trust the old ways, the remedies that Native Americans and trappers had used for generations. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that Viola Jensen was someone worth knowing. He followed her at a distance as she rode home, staying far enough back that she would not notice him in the darkness. He watched as she reached a small cabin built against the base of a rocky hill, with a garden growing in front and bundles of drying herbs hanging from the porch. She stabled her horse, gave the animal water and feed, and then went inside. A lamp was lit moments later, casting a warm glow through the windows. Henry made camp a mile away, in a small canyon he knew well. He would visit her tomorrow, he decided. He would introduce himself properly, would tell her that he had medicines to trade, herbs from higher elevations that did not grow in the desert. It was a reasonable excuse, and it would give him a chance to see if she was as skilled as the stories suggested. What he did not expect was that he would find her in trouble the very next morning. Henry rode into Old Tucson just after dawn, when the air was still relatively cool and the town was beginning to wake. He heard the commotion before he saw it, angry voices coming from the general store. When he rode closer, he saw Doctor Whitfield standing on the wooden sidewalk, addressing a crowd that had gathered. Viola stood a few feet away, her chin raised defiantly, her green eyes flashing with anger. "This woman is a menace to public health," the doctor was saying. "She practices medicine without training or license, and she endangers every person who trusts her false remedies. Last night, she interfered with my treatment of Sarah Porter, and it is only by God's grace that the woman survived despite her meddling." "Sarah survived because of me," Viola said, her voice carrying clearly. "She was dying from your leeches and your ignorance. You would have bled her until there was nothing left." "How dare you question my methods?" Dr. Whitfield shouted. "I studied at one of the finest medical colleges in Philadelphia. I have credentials, education, years of training. What do you have? some weeds picked from the desert and superstitions handed down by ignorant women. Several people in the crowd murmured. Henry could see that opinion was divided. Some nodded in agreement with the doctor, impressed by his credentials and his fine clothes. Others looked uncertain, remembering times when Viola had helped them or their families. Old Tucson was changing, growing more civilized, and with civilization came pressure to abandon the old ways in favor of modern science. "I have results," Viola said quietly. "I have mothers and babies who are alive. I have men who recovered from fevers and wounds. I have never claimed to be a doctor, but I know the plants of this land, and I know how to use them. That is more than can be said for someone who applies the same treatments here that he learned in a city 1,000 miles away, without understanding this desert or these people." "You are a fraud and a danger," Dr. Whitfield said, "and I am calling for the territorial authorities to ban your practice. I am writing to the medical board in Prescott, and I am asking the sheriff to prohibit you from treating anyone until this matter is resolved." Sheriff Davis stepped forward from the crowd, a middle-aged man with a tired face. Henry knew him slightly, had sold him furs in the past. The sheriff looked uncomfortable with the situation. "Now, doctor, I am not sure I have the authority to stop Miss Jensen from helping folks if they ask for her help," the sheriff said slowly. "Then you are failing in your duty to protect the citizens of this town," Dr. Whitfield snapped. "When someone dies because of her incompetence, their blood will be on your hands as well as hers." Henry had heard enough. He dismounted and walked through the crowd, his height and build causing people to step aside automatically. He stopped next to Viola, close enough that his presence was clearly a statement of support. "Sarah Porter is alive and well this morning," Henry said, his voice deep and calm. "I watched the house all night. I saw the doctor leave in anger, and I saw Miss Jensen work for hours to save that woman's life. Anyone who wants to verify this can ride out to the Porter Ranch and see for themselves." Dr. Whitfield stared at him. "And who are you?" "Henry Booker. I live in the mountains. And I trust Miss Jensen's remedies more than I would trust any doctor." "Another ignorant fool," the doctor said dismissively. "Your opinion means nothing." "It means more than you think," Henry replied. "There are a lot of people in this territory who live far from town, who cannot afford fancy doctors with their expensive treatments. We rely on knowledge of the land, on remedies that have worked for hundreds of years. You come here from back east and think you know better than everyone, but you do not know this place. You do not understand it." Viola glanced at him, surprise evident in her eyes. She had never seen this man before, had no idea why he was defending her. But she was grateful for his presence, for the way the crowd seemed to be reconsidering their position now that someone else had spoken up. "The Porter Ranch," someone in the crowd said. "Let us go see how Sarah is doing. That will settle this." Dr. Whitfield's face tightened. "That proves nothing. The woman may have survived, but that does not mean this fraud's methods were responsible. Natural healing, the body's own resilience, those are the true reasons for recovery." "Then why were your treatments not working?" Another voice called out. "Why was Sarah dying before Miss Jensen arrived?" The doctor had no good answer for that. The crowd began to disperse, some people heading toward their horses to ride out to the Porter Ranch, others returning to their morning business. Dr. Whitfield stood on the sidewalk, his face dark with rage, before turning and stalking back to his office. Viola let out a long breath. "Thank you," she said to Henry. "I do not believe we have met." "Henry Booker," he said, extending his hand. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a striking gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. His handshake was firm but careful, as if he was conscious of his own strength. "I have heard about your work. I wanted to meet you. You came down from the mountains just to meet me." Viola asked, skepticism in her voice. "I came to trade furs and buy supplies," Henry admitted. "Meeting you was going to be a secondary purpose. But then I heard the commotion this morning, and you decided to involve yourself in my troubles." "Why?" Henry considered the question. "Because I have no use for doctors who think their degrees make them gods. Because I saw you save Sarah Porter's life last night, and I know skill when I see it. And because someone needed to stand up for what is right." Viola studied him for a long moment. She was used to people being intimidated by her knowledge and her refusal to be deferential to those who thought themselves her betters. But this mountain man looked at her with respect, with genuine admiration, and it caught her off guard. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "I feel I owe you at least that much." Henry smiled, and the expression transformed his rugged face. "I would like that very much." They walked to a small restaurant at the edge of town, a place run by a Mexican family that served strong coffee and fresh tortillas. Viola ordered for both of them, and they sat at a table by the window where they could watch the street. "You said you watched the house all night," Viola said. "Why?" "I wanted to know if you were as good as people said," Henry replied honestly. "I have been living alone in the mountains for 5 years now. I know herbs, I know remedies, but I am always looking to learn more. When I heard there was an herbalist in Old Tucson who could cure things doctors could not, I was curious. And now that you have seen me work, what do you think?" "I think you are remarkable," Henry said simply. "I think you have a gift, and I think that doctor is a fool for not recognizing it." Viola felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. She was not used to such straightforward praise, not from men. Most men in Old Tucson either dismissed her entirely or looked at her with suspicion, wondering why a woman of 24 was unmarried and living alone, pursuing work that was traditionally done by old women or men. "How long have you been practicing?" Henry asked. "Since I was 16, Viola said. "My grandmother taught me everything she knew before she died. She was the herbalist in Old Tucson for 40 years. Everyone trusted her. But when I took over her work, people were less certain. A young woman, unmarried, living alone, it made them uncomfortable. Dr. Whitfield arrived 2 years ago, and he has been trying to discredit me ever since." "Why? Is he afraid of competition?" "Partly. But I think he genuinely believes that formal medical education is the only valid form of healing. He sees folk medicine as primitive, dangerous. He does not understand that there is wisdom in the old ways, that plants and herbs have been used successfully for thousands of years." Henry nodded. "I have seen what plants can do. I had an infected wound 3 years ago, deep cut on my leg from a hunting knife. I thought I might lose the leg, maybe die from the infection. But a Tohono O'odham woman I trade with, she gave me a poultice made from creosote bush and prickly pear. Saved my life. No doctor could have done better." "Creosote is powerful," Viola agreed. "But you have to know how to use it properly. Too much can be toxic. That is the difference between someone like you and someone like Dr. Whitfield," Henry said. "You understand that healing is not just about knowing what plants do. It is about understanding the land, the people, the balance of things. That takes more than book learning." They talked for over an hour, sharing knowledge and experiences. Viola told him about the herbs she used, the remedies she had developed, the patients she had treated. Henry told her about life in the mountains, about the plants that grew at higher elevations, about the wildlife and the seasons and the solitude. Viola found herself fascinated by his stories, by the life he had built for himself away from civilization. "Why did you leave?" she asked finally. "Why live alone in the mountains for 5 years?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "My family died," he said at last. "My mother, my father, my younger sister. All within the space of 2 years. Fever, infection, and accident. After my sister died, I could not stay in Missouri anymore. Everything reminded me of them. So I came west, looking for something different, and I found the mountains. Up there, I do not have to think about what I lost. I can just live." Viola reached across the table and touched his hand, a brief gesture of sympathy. "I am sorry. That must have been terrible." "It was a long time ago," Henry said, though his eyes suggested the pain was still fresh. "What about you? Why are you alone?" "My parents died when I was young," Viola said. "My grandmother raised me. She never married, devoted her life to healing. She taught me that a woman does not need a husband to have purpose or value. I suppose I followed her example. I have had offers over the years, but none of the men interested me. They wanted a wife who would cook and clean and bear children, not a wife who would spend her days in the desert gathering herbs and her nights treating the sick." "Their loss," Henry said. Viola smiled. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I am too difficult, too independent. That is what Dr. Whitfield says, at least. He thinks my unmarried status is evidence of unnatural character." "Dr. Whitfield is an idiot," Henry said flatly, and Viola laughed. They spent the rest of the morning together. Henry showed Viola the furs he had brought to trade, and she helped him negotiate a fair price with the general store owner. In return, Viola showed Henry her garden, explaining which plants she cultivated and which she gathered wild. Henry was impressed by her knowledge, by the meticulous care she took with each plant. She had created a small paradise in the harsh desert, coaxing life from the dry soil through careful irrigation and constant attention. "You should come to the mountains sometime," Henry said as they stood in her garden. "There are plants up there you might find useful. Devil's claw, Arizona sycamore bark, mountain laurel. I could show you where they grow." "I would like that," Viola said, and she realized she meant it. There was something about Henry that drew her, something beyond his physical presence or his defense of her that morning. He understood her work in a way few people did. He respected her knowledge without trying to diminish it or question it. He looked at her as an equal, and that was rare. Over the following weeks, Henry became a regular presence in Viola's life. He came down from the mountains every few days, always with some excuse. He brought her plants from higher elevations, or meat from his hunting, or simply stopped by to talk. They would sit on her porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the desert, sharing stories and knowledge. Viola taught him about desert plants he had not encountered before. Henry taught her about tracking animals and reading weather signs and surviving in the wilderness. Dr. Whitfield continued his campaign against Viola. He wrote letters to the territorial authorities. He spoke against her to anyone who would listen. He even tried to convince the sheriff to arrest her for practicing medicine without a license. But most people in Old Tucson remembered Sarah Porter, remembered how Viola had saved her life when the doctor had failed. They continued to seek Viola's help, and she continued to treat them with skill and compassion. One evening in early September, as the oppressive summer heat was finally beginning to break, Henry arrived at Viola's cabin looking troubled. She was in her garden, harvesting seeds from dried flowers, and she looked up in surprise when she heard his horse approaching. It was later than he usually came, and the sun had already set. "What is wrong?" she asked, immediately sensing something amiss. "There is a prospector up in the mountains," Henry said, dismounting quickly. "He came to my cabin this afternoon, barely able to walk. His leg is broken, compound fracture. The bone is through the skin. He needs help, but he cannot make it down to town, and I do not have the knowledge to set a break like that." "How far?" Viola asked, already moving toward her cabin. 3 hours on horseback, maybe less if we push. Can you come?" Of course. Viola did not hesitate. She gathered her supplies, packing herbs and bandages and splints into her saddlebags. She changed into riding clothes, practical trousers, and a shirt that would allow her to move freely. Within 20 minutes, they were riding north toward the mountains. The ride was difficult in the darkness, but Henry knew the trails well. They climbed steadily, leaving the desert behind and entering forests of pine and oak. The air grew cooler, and Viola breathed deeply, grateful for the change. She had grown up in the desert, but she loved the mountains, loved the green growing things and the sound of wind in the trees. Henry's cabin was located in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was larger than Viola had expected, a solid structure built from logs with a stone fireplace and glass windows. Inside, a man lay on Henry's bed, his face gray with pain. He looked to be in his 50s, weathered and thin. His right leg was badly broken, the bone visible through torn flesh. Viola assessed the injury quickly. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday morning," the prospector said through clenched teeth. "I was climbing down a cliff face and the rope broke, fell 20 feet, thought I was going to die up there alone." "You are lucky Henry found you," Viola said. She turned to Henry. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and I need you to help me. This is going to be difficult, and he will need to be held still." Henry moved to comply, heating water over the fire. Viola prepared a strong tea from willow bark and wild lettuce, a combination that would dull pain without rendering the prospector unconscious. She needed him aware enough to tell her if she was causing further damage. While he drank the tea, she cleaned the wound carefully, removing dirt and debris. The bone needed to be set properly, or the man would never walk again. "This is going to hurt," Viola told the prospector, "but I promise I will be as gentle as I can." "Just do what you need to do," he said, and she could hear the fear beneath his bravado. Henry held the man's shoulders, using his considerable strength to keep him immobile. Viola worked with steady hands, manipulating the bone back into place. The prospector screamed, a sound that echoed through the cabin, but Viola did not stop. She felt the bone align, felt it settle into the proper position. Then she cleaned the wound again, applied a poultice of yarrow and comfrey to prevent infection and promote healing, and splinted the leg securely. By the time she finished, the prospector had passed out from the pain, and Viola was drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. Henry released his grip and stepped back, looking at her with undisguised admiration. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "It was necessary," Viola replied, cleaning her hands. "He will need to stay immobile for at least 6 weeks. The bone will take time to heal and there is still risk of infection. Someone will need to care for him." "He can stay here," Henry said. "I will look after him." "Can you do that alone?" "It will be a lot of work." Henry looked at her, and something in his expression made Viola's heart beat faster. "I was hoping you might stay too, at least for a few days, to make sure he stabilizes. I can bring you back to town whenever you need to go, but right now, I think he needs you here." Viola knew she should refuse. It would not be proper staying in a mountain cabin alone with Henry. People would talk. Dr. Whitfield would have more ammunition against her, but the prospector needed care, and Henry needed help, and Viola found that she did not care what people thought. "I will stay," she said. Those 3 days in the mountains changed everything. Viola and Henry worked together to care for the prospector, whose name turned out to be James. They took turns sitting with him through the night, monitoring his fever, changing his bandages, making sure he drank enough water. During the day, when James was sleeping, Viola and Henry would talk, long conversations that ranged from medicine to philosophy to their dreams and fears. Viola learned that Henry had been a schoolteacher before coming west, that he loved poetry and could recite entire passages from memory. She learned that he had built his cabin with his own hands, that he made his living by trapping and hunting and trading. She learned that he was lonely, despite his claims of preferring solitude, and that he had been drawn to Old Tucson more and more frequently because of her. Henry learned that Viola had wanted to be a doctor when she was young, before she realized that medical colleges did not accept women. He learned that she kept journals filled with careful observations about plants and their effects, that she was compiling information that could someday be published. He learned that she was brilliant and passionate and brave, and that he was falling in love with her. On the third evening, when James was finally stable and sleeping peacefully, Viola and Henry sat outside the cabin and watched stars spread across the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The air was cool and clean, and Viola wrapped herself in a blanket Henry had given her. "I should go back tomorrow," she said quietly. "People will be looking for me. I have patients who depend on me." "I know," Henry said, "but I will miss you." Viola turned to look at him, seeing him clearly in the starlight. His handsome face was serious, his gray-blue eyes intense. "I will miss you too, Viola," Henry said, and then stopped as if unsure how to continue. "Yes, I know we have not known each other long, just a few months, but I have never met anyone like you. You are brilliant and brave and beautiful, and when I am with you, I feel like I have found something I did not know I was looking for." Viola's breath caught. "Henry, I am not good with words," he continued. "I live alone in the mountains because I do not know how to be around people anymore. But with you it is easy. With you I can be myself, and I do not want that to end." "Neither do I," Viola said softly. Henry reached out and took her hand, his large fingers warm and gentle. "I do not know what this is between us or where it might lead, but I would like to find out, if you would." Viola felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. She had convinced herself years ago that she would never marry, never fall in love. Her work was too important, too consuming. No man would accept her as she was, independent and skilled and unwilling to be diminished. But Henry was not like other men. He saw her gifts and celebrated them. He respected her knowledge and wanted to learn from her. He did not try to control or change her. "I would like that too," she said. Henry smiled, that transforming smile that made him look younger and happier. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture of respect and affection. They sat together under the stars, hands clasped, two solitary people who had found each other in the wilderness. When Viola returned to Old Tucson the next day, she found the town in an uproar. Dr. Whitfield had used her absence to spread rumors, suggesting that she had fled because she knew her fraudulent practices were about to be exposed. He had convinced several town council members to meet and discuss banning unlicensed medical practice within town limits. The meeting was scheduled for that evening, and Viola was expected to attend and defend herself. She was exhausted from 3 days of intensive nursing and a long ride down the mountain, but she cleaned up and went to the meeting. It was held in the town hall, a simple wooden building that served multiple purposes. The council members sat at a long table at the front, and Dr. Whitfield stood to one side with a smug expression. About 50 townspeople had gathered to observe, including several of Viola's former patients. "Miss Jensen," the council chairman said when she entered. His name was Robert Morrison, a banker who had lived in Old Tucson for 15 years. "We have called this meeting to address concerns about your practice. Dr. Whitfield has made serious allegations, and we feel it is time to establish clear regulations about medical care in this town." "I understand," Viola said calmly. "What would you like to know?" Dr. Whitfield stepped forward. Where have you been for the past 3 days, Miss Jensen? Patients were looking for you. What could possibly be more important than your supposed calling to heal the sick? I was in the mountains treating a prospector with a compound fracture, Viola replied. His leg was badly broken, the bone through the skin. He could not travel, so I went to him. I set the bone, treated his wound, and stayed to monitor for infection. He is now stable and healing. And who can verify this convenient story? The doctor asked skeptically. I can. Henry's deep voice came from the back of the room. Viola turned to see him entering, ducking slightly to fit through the doorway. He had ridden down after her, unable to let her face this alone. He walked forward, his presence commanding attention, and stood beside Viola. I am the one who asked Miss Jensen to come, Henry said. The prospector, James Miller, was at my cabin. I found him injured and brought him there because he could not make it to town. I did not have the skill to set a break like that, so I went to Miss Jensen. She worked for hours to save his leg, and she stayed to make sure he did not develop infection. James is alive and will walk again because of her skill. Dr. Whitfield glared at him. And you are hardly an unbiased witness. Everyone knows you have been spending time with Miss Jensen. For all we know, you are collaborating on this story. Are you calling me a liar? Henry asked quietly, but there was steel in his voice. The doctor hesitated, recognizing danger. Henry was not a man to provoke lightly. I am saying that we need more than the word of a mountain man and an unlicensed herbalist. Then I will take you to see James, Henry said. Right now, tonight. We can ride up to my cabin and you can examine him yourself. You can see the splint, the healing wound, the treatment Viola provided. And then you can admit that she saved a man's leg and possibly his life. Dr. Whitfield's face reddened. I am not riding into the mountains in the middle of the night. Then stop questioning her integrity, Henry said flatly. The council members looked uncertain. Robert Morrison cleared his throat. Dr. Whitfield has raised concerns about unlicensed practice, but I think we need to consider the reality of our situation. We are a growing town, yes, but we are still in the territory. Many people live far from town, cannot afford expensive medical care. Miss Jensen has been providing a valuable service for years. A dangerous service, Dr. Whitfield interjected. She has no training, no accountability. What happens when someone dies because of her incompetence? What happens when someone dies because they cannot afford your fees? Viola asked quietly. What happens when people are afraid to seek help because they know they will be charged more than they can pay? I do not claim to be a doctor. I am an herbalist, a healer. I use the knowledge passed down to me by my grandmother, knowledge that has saved lives in this town. I ask for payment only when people can afford it, and I treat anyone who comes to me, regardless of their ability to pay. Can you say the same? Dr. Whitfield had no answer for that. Several people in the crowd murmured in agreement. Viola saw Sarah Porter standing with her husband, holding her healthy baby. She saw the father of a child Viola had cured of fever. She saw a rancher whose infected hand Viola had treated, saving him from amputation. I move that we take no action regarding Miss Jensen's practice, one of the council members said. She has provided good service to this community, and I see no reason to stop her from continuing. I second the motion, another member said immediately. The vote was 4-1 in Viola's favor, with only one council member siding with Dr. Whitfield. The chairman banged his gavel. Motion carries. Miss Jensen, you may continue your practice without interference from this council. Meeting adjourned. Dr. Whitfield stormed from the hall, his face dark with rage. Viola felt relief wash over her, so intense that her knees went weak. Henry steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch gentle despite his strength. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am now," she said. "Thank you for coming. I did not expect you to follow me." "I could not let you face them alone," Henry said simply. "Besides, I wanted to make sure that Doctor understood he cannot bully you." Several townspeople came forward to congratulate Viola, to express their support. Sarah Porter hugged her, tears in her eyes. "You saved my life," she said. "I will never forget that. None of us will." When the crowd finally dispersed, Viola and Henry walked together through the quiet streets of Old Tucson. The moon was full, casting silver light over the adobe buildings and dusty roads. Viola felt exhausted but triumphant, grateful that the fight was over, at least for now. "Will you go back to the mountains tonight?" she asked Henry as they reached her cabin. "I should," Henry said. "James needs someone to look after him, but I do not want to leave you." "Then stay," Viola said. "Just for tonight. You can sleep on the couch and go back in the morning. I do not want to be alone right now." Henry agreed, and they sat together on her porch, talking quietly until the stars began to fade and dawn approached. Viola learned more about his past, about the family he had lost, about his reasons for seeking solitude. Henry learned about her dreams, about her hope to someday write a comprehensive guide to desert plants and their medicinal uses. They talked about the future, about possibilities and hopes. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Henry took Viola's hand. "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "All right," Viola said, her heart beating faster. "I love you," Henry said simply. "I know it has only been a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything. You are remarkable, Viola Jensen. You are strong and skilled and compassionate, and I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to help you with your work, to learn from you, to support you in everything you do. I do not want a wife who will stay home and keep house. I want a partner, an equal. I want you." Viola felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. "I love you too," she said. "I did not think I could, did not think I would ever meet someone who understood me, but you do. You see me for who I am, and you celebrate it instead of trying to change it. Yes, Henry. Yes to everything." Henry pulled her close, and they kissed as the sun rose over the desert, a kiss that was tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, both filled with happiness that seemed too big to contain. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Old Tucson. Sarah Porter stood as Viola's witness, and James Miller, whose leg was healing well thanks to Viola's treatment, stood as Henry's witness. Dr. Whitfield did not attend, but most of the town did, people who had been helped by Viola and people who respected Henry. It was a joyful celebration, with music and dancing and food shared by everyone. After the wedding, Viola and Henry faced a decision. Henry's cabin in the mountains was comfortable but isolated. Viola's cabin in town was convenient for her patients but small. They decided to keep both, splitting their time between the mountains and the town. Henry built an addition onto Viola's cabin, creating a workroom where she could prepare her medicines and see patients. Viola helped Henry expand his garden at the mountain cabin, planting herbs that thrived at higher elevations. Their life together was everything Viola had not dared to hope for. Henry supported her work completely, often accompanying her when she went to treat patients. His presence was reassuring, and his strength was useful when she needed to move someone or hold them still during treatment. He also proved to be an excellent assistant, quick to learn and careful in his work. Together, they treated more patients than Viola had been able to reach alone, traveling throughout the territory to help those in need. Dr. Whitfield continued to practice in Old Tucson, but his influence waned over time. People had seen the results of Viola's work, had experienced her compassion and skill. When given a choice between the expensive, often ineffective treatments of the doctor and the proven remedies of the herbalist, most chose Viola. The doctor eventually left town 2 years after the wedding, moving to Prescott, where he hoped to find a more receptive audience for his credentials. James Miller recovered fully and became a close friend of the couple. He opened a successful trading post in Old Tucson and often helped Viola acquire rare herbs and supplies. He told everyone who would listen about how Viola had saved his leg and his life, and his testimony did much to cement her reputation throughout the territory. In the spring of 1876, Viola discovered she was pregnant. She was both thrilled and terrified, knowing the dangers of childbirth, knowing how many women she had tried and failed to save over the years. But Henry was there every step of the way, attentive and supportive. He insisted that she rest more, that she let him take on more of the physical work. He built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, carving it with designs of desert flowers and mountain peaks. Their son was born in December, during a rare snowfall that dusted the desert with white. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Viola was afraid, but Henry never left her side. He held her hand, encouraged her, and when their baby finally arrived, he cried as he held the tiny, perfect child. They named him Thomas, after Viola's grandfather, and he grew into a strong, healthy boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's quick mind. Viola continued her practice, though she took on fewer patients during Thomas's first year. Henry was a devoted father, carrying Thomas everywhere in a sling he made, teaching him about plants and animals and the natural world from the time he could focus his eyes. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a girl with dark hair and green eyes like Viola's. They named her Grace, and she proved to be as spirited and independent as her mother. The cabin in Old Tucson rang with the sounds of children's laughter, and Viola marveled at the family she had created, the life she had built with Henry. As the children grew, Viola began working on her book, the comprehensive guide to desert and mountain plants she had always dreamed of writing. Henry helped her, illustrating the plants with careful sketches, recording observations from their years of experience. They worked on it together in the evenings, after the children were asleep, and it became a labor of love that took 7 years to complete. In 1883, their book was finally published by a printing house in San Francisco. A Practical Guide to Medicinal Plants of the Southwest Territories by Viola Booker and Henry Booker became unexpectedly popular, used by doctors and herbalists throughout the region. It brought them some money, but more importantly, it brought validation. Viola's knowledge, dismissed by Dr. Whitfield as mere superstition, was now recognized as valuable medical information. The book also brought visitors to Old Tucson, people who wanted to learn from Viola and Henry. They began teaching, offering classes on plant identification and medicinal preparation. Young women who wanted to be healers came to study with Viola, and she passed on her grandmother's knowledge to a new generation. Thomas grew into a tall, strong young man like his father, but he had no interest in healing. He loved the land itself, loved ranching and farming. At 21, he married a rancher's daughter and bought land north of Old Tucson, where he raised cattle and horses. He gave Viola and Henry their first grandchild, a boy named Henry after his grandfather. Grace followed in her mother's footsteps, showing an early aptitude for healing and an instinctive understanding of plants. She became Viola's apprentice at 15, and by 20 she was treating patients on her own. She married a teacher who had come to Old Tucson to run the new school, and they had 3 children. Grace never stopped practicing, teaching her own daughters the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of healing women. As Viola and Henry grew older, they spent more time in the mountains, at the cabin that had been witness to the beginning of their love. They still treated patients when needed, but mostly they enjoyed the peace and beauty of their surroundings. They hiked through the forests, collected plants, and spent long evenings on the porch watching the sun set. On their 30th anniversary in 1904, their children and grandchildren gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. It was a warm September evening, and the family filled the cabin and spilled out into the clearing. There was food and music and storytelling, and Viola looked around at the faces of the people she loved, marveling at how much her life had changed. Henry found her standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the mountains. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. At 60, he was still strong, still protective, still devoted to her in every way. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Viola said, leaning back against him. 30 years ago, I thought I would spend my life alone, devoted to my work. I never imagined I could have this, a husband who loves me, children and grandchildren, a life so full of joy. "I am the lucky one," Henry said, kissing her temple. "You gave me a reason to come down from the mountains, a reason to be part of the world again. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Viola corrected. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as their family laughed and celebrated. Thomas was teaching his son to play the fiddle, the same fiddle Henry had played when he courted Viola. Grace was showing her daughters a plant she had found, explaining its properties with the same passion Viola had always brought to her teaching. The grandchildren ran through the clearing, playing games in the fading light. "You remember the first time we met?" Viola asked. "When you defended me against Doctor Whitfield." "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever seen," Henry said. "Standing there in front of all those people, refusing to back down, refusing to apologize for your knowledge. I knew right then that you were special. I remember thinking you were either very brave or very foolish," Viola said with a laugh. "Stepping in to defend a woman you had never met, taking on a doctor in front of the whole town." "Both, probably," Henry admitted. "But I could not stand by and watch him attack you. It felt wrong. And I am glad I intervened because it led to this, to us, to everything we have built together." As darkness fell and stars began to appear, the family gathered around a fire. Thomas played his fiddle and people sang old songs. Children fell asleep in their parents' laps. Viola sat beside Henry, his arm around her shoulders, and felt a profound sense of contentment. She had lived a good life, a meaningful life. She had helped countless people, had passed on her knowledge, had raised children who would carry on her work. And through it all, she had been loved by this remarkable man who had seen her gifts and celebrated them. Years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow. Henry's health began to decline when he was 65, his strong body finally succumbing to a lifetime of hard work and the harsh conditions of frontier life. Viola cared for him with all the skill and tenderness she had shown her patients over the years, using her herbs to ease his pain and strengthen his body. She gave him several more good years, years they spent mostly at the mountain cabin, surrounded by the beauty they both loved. Henry died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, with Viola beside him and their children nearby. The funeral brought people from across the territory, men and women whose lives he had touched, whose respect he had earned. He was buried on the mountain he loved, in a clearing with a view of the desert below. Viola grieved deeply, feeling the loss of her partner, her love, her best friend. But she did not retreat into sorrow. She continued her work, continued teaching, continued living the life they had built together. She knew that Henry would want her to carry on, to keep helping people, to keep sharing her knowledge. Grace took over most of the day-to-day healing work, but Viola remained active well into her 70s. She still taught classes, still consulted on difficult cases, still gathered herbs in the desert. She published a second edition of her book, updated with new information and observations. She watched her grandchildren grow and marry, watched great-grandchildren arrive, tiny miracles that connected her to the future. On a warm spring day in 1912, Viola went to the mountain cabin one last time. She was 78 years old, her body frail but her mind still sharp. Grace tried to convince her to stay in town, but Viola insisted. She wanted to see the mountains again, wanted to be in the place where she and Henry had fallen in love. She spent 3 days at the cabin, walking slowly through the forest, sitting by the stream, remembering. She visited Henry's grave and told him about the grandchildren, about Grace's success, about the young women who were learning the healing arts. She told him she missed him, that she loved him, that she would see him soon. On the morning of the 4th day, Grace found her mother sitting in the chair on the porch, looking out at the mountains. She was gone, her passing as peaceful as Henry's had been. Her face was serene, almost smiling, as if she had seen something wonderful in those last moments. Viola was buried beside Henry, in the clearing with the view of the desert. Their children and grandchildren gathered, along with dozens of people whose lives had been touched by her healing. They told stories about her skill, her kindness, her unwavering dedication to helping others. They spoke of how she had fought for her right to practice, had refused to be intimidated or silenced, had proven that traditional healing had value alongside modern medicine. Grace continued her mother's work, and when she grew old, her daughter took over. The tradition of healing women continued in Old Tucson, a living legacy of Viola Jensen Booker and the knowledge she had preserved and shared. Her book remained in print, used by healers throughout the Southwest. Her methods were studied and validated by later medical research, proving what she had known through experience and intuition. The cabin in the mountains became a place of pilgrimage for herbalists and healers, people who wanted to see where Viola and Henry had lived and worked. The garden she had planted still grew there, tended by family members, and people came to gather herbs and to pay their respects to a woman who had changed healing in the territory. In Old Tucson, a bronze plaque was placed outside what had been Viola's cabin, commemorating her contributions to medicine and healing. It read, Viola Jensen Booker, 1850–1928, herbalist and healer. She trusted the wisdom of the earth and the knowledge of generations. She helped countless people and proved that compassion and skill need no formal license. She lived with courage and died with honor. Years later, when the Arizona Territory became a state and Old Tucson evolved into a modern city, people still remembered Viola and Henry. Their story became part of local legend, the herbalist who defied a doctor and the mountain man who loved her. It was a story about courage and knowledge, about standing up for what was right, about finding love in unexpected places. It was a story about two people who had been alone, who had found each other, and who had built a life together that mattered. A life of healing and teaching, of raising children and helping neighbors, of growing old together in the place they loved. It was a simple story in many ways, the kind that played out countless times across the frontier. But it was also extraordinary, because Viola and Henry had lived it with intention and passion, with dedication to their values and to each other. Their graves in the mountains remained undisturbed, marked by simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths. In spring, wildflowers grew around the stones, planted by nature or by visiting family members. In summer, the shade of pine trees kept the ground cool. In fall, leaves drifted down to cover them like a blanket. In winter, snow occasionally dusted the mountain, rare and beautiful. And if you visited those graves on a quiet evening, when the sun was setting and the light turned golden, you might understand something of what Viola and Henry had found together. You might feel the peace of the mountains, the healing power of the natural world, the enduring strength of love. You might understand why a herbalist chose this life, and why a mountain man chose her, and why their story mattered enough to be remembered long after they were gone. It was a story that said healing came in many forms, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, that love could transform solitary lives into something beautiful and meaningful. It was a story of the Wild West, of a time when the territory was still rough and dangerous, when life was hard and people had to be harder. But it was also a story of hope and possibility, of two people who refused to accept limitations, who created their own path and followed it with courage. Viola had been called a fraud by a doctor who could not see beyond his own education and prejudices. But she had proven him wrong, not through argument or credentials, but through results, through patients saved, through knowledge shared, through a lifetime of service to her community. She had shown that traditional healing had value, that the wisdom of generations was worth preserving, that compassion was as important as competence. Henry had trusted her remedies and her wisdom more than any formal medicine, and that trust had been rewarded. She had saved his friend's leg. She had taught him about healing. She had given him love and family and purpose. Together, they had created something that lasted far beyond their own lives, a legacy of healing and learning that continued through their descendants. Their love story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though it had moments of both. It was a story of daily choices, of small acts of kindness and support, of two people building a life together one day at a time. It was a story of partnership, of equals who respected and admired each other, who worked together toward common goals. It was a story of love that grew deeper over time, strengthened by shared challenges and joys. In the end, that was what made their story special. Not that they had overcome opposition or built successful careers, though they had done both. Not that they had raised good children or written an important book, though those achievements mattered. What made their story special was that they had loved each other truly and deeply, had supported each other completely, had created a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. They had shown that it was possible to have both love and meaningful work, that a woman could be both a healer and a wife and mother, that a man could be both strong and gentle, both independent and devoted. They had lived according to their own values, had refused to compromise their principles, had created a life that was authentic and fulfilling. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death. But it also continued, through children and grandchildren, through students and patients, through anyone who learned from their example. It continued in the herbs that still grew in their gardens, in the knowledge recorded in their book, in the memories passed down through generations. It continued in the lives they had touched, and the healing they had brought to their corner of the territory. And perhaps, in some sense, it never really ended at all. Perhaps their love was the kind that transcended death, that lived on in the mountains they loved, and the desert they had called home. Perhaps on quiet evenings, when the light turned golden and the air grew cool, their spirits walked together through the forest, hands clasped, talking and laughing as they had in life. Perhaps they were still together, still partners, still in love. That is what people like to believe anyway. And in Old Tucson, where stories mattered and legends were passed down with care, the story of the herbalist and the mountain man became one of the most beloved. It was told to children as they grew, taught as part of local history, remembered as an example of what was possible when courage met opportunity, when love found wisdom, when two solitary souls became one. Viola Jensen Booker and Henry Booker had lived and loved and healed in the Wild West of the late 19th century. They had faced opposition and overcome it. They had built a family and a legacy. They had proven that traditional knowledge had value, that women could be healers and teachers, that love could flourish even in harsh conditions. And in doing so, they had created something beautiful and lasting, something worthy of being remembered long after they were gone. Their story was complete, their lives fully lived, their love eternal. And that was the best ending of all.